I think what Sophie Cunningham is saying here about the Indiana Fever offense should be obvious. This should be how it is.
Sophie Cunningham just lit the WNBA on fire, not with her game, but with her words. During a recent podcast, she spoke what many insiders quietly believe, but few have dared to say out loud, that Caitlin Clark, like LeBron James in his prime, should have control over the Fever's entire offensive system.
If you're a Caitlin Clark, if you're a LeBron James, your system should, your basketball offensive system should run through that superstar.
In Sophie's mind, when you have a generational player, the team should revolve around her. But that simple statement sent social media into chaos. Overnight, Sophie went from respected veteran to public enemy, attacked by haters, rival fans, and even a few Clark supporters who claimed she'd gone too far. The fallout exposed a deeper divide in the WNBA between old guard loyalty and the new wave of stardom Caitlin represents. What started as honest basketball talk has now become one of the most explosive controversies the Fever have faced all season.
And Sophie Cunningham has come out and said such, and says that it was running through her. I guess when she was on the court. Now, we saw a few times where it looked like it was actually running through her. But we also saw times where it looked like it absolutely was not. She was playing off the ball way too much. But what has surprised me about these comments is Sophie Cunningham is getting attacked. What? Why is this happening? And unfortunately, she's getting attacked from the haters and from some Caitlin Clark fans. Some Caitlin Clark fans.
When Sophie Cunningham opened up on her podcast, no one expected her words to dominate headlines across the WNBA. What started as a casual basketball discussion quickly spiraled into one of the most polarizing conversations of the season. Sophie was talking about what it means to build an offense around a generational talent, and she compared Caitlin Clark to LeBron James, saying that players of that caliber naturally deserve control over the system. It wasn't a diss, it wasn't arrogance, it was basketball logic.
Some Caitlin Clark fans are saying, well, she shouldn't even say this out loud. And I'm like, but Sophie was on the team and knows what's going on. Everybody's got to ask for permission. I don't get that. I really don't. I think she's just stating something that we can all see with our own eyes if we're paying attention at all.
When you have someone who changes the pace, tempo, and energy of every possession, you design everything to fit their strengths. But in today's WNBA climate, where every statement is dissected and spun, her honesty was treated like a declaration of war. Within hours, clips from the podcast were everywhere. Twitter threads, Reddit debates, and fan pages exploded with takes. Some called her a real one for saying what others were too scared to admit. Others accused her of overstepping, claiming she was chasing clout and stirring drama for clicks. But Sophie didn't seem to care. In her mind, she was doing what leaders do, speaking truth, even if it ruffles feathers.
Be Caitlin or like a healthy LeBron, wherever they go, that team will probably be above 500.
Yep. But
is that fair to say?
Yes, but I think that the reason behind that is because those types of athletes, they get to come into an organization, they have the green light, and they can do whatever they want. Where that is very rare to get drafted and be able to control the whole system.
And if anyone doubted her right to comment, they forgot that Sophie had actually been there on the floor with Caitlin. Battling through the growing pains of a rebuilding Fever roster, she wasn't speculating. She was telling her side of the story. Still, the problem wasn't what Sophie said, it was how people heard it. Many fans twisted her comments, suggesting that she was blaming teammates for the team's struggles or revealing private locker room dynamics. But in context, Sophie was pointing out something everyone could see. Caitlin's game is built on freedom, space, and rhythm. Restrict that, and you restrict what makes her special. To Sophie, it was simple. To the internet, it was scandal.
But when you have a generational talent like that, she should have a lot to say of the system.
Okay, so you heard it. If you've got a generational talent like that, she should make some of these decisions. Well, for whatever reason, this got her hate. And I'm not sure why.
Then came the backlash from unexpected places. Even some Caitlin Clark supporters who said, Sophie should have kept her mouth shut and avoided speaking on team affairs. That's when the narrative began to shift from basketball to politics. Suddenly, Sophie wasn't just a player giving her opinion. She was a symbol of a larger culture clash within the WNBA. Was the league ready to embrace outspoken voices? Or would every honest take be labeled as drama?
There is a small group of Caitlin Clark fans and a small group of Indiana Fever fans that are anti-Sophie Cunningham fans. All right? By the way, they're part of the old WNBA fandom too.
As the comments kept spreading, one thing became clear. Sophie's podcast had touched a nerve. Whether fans agreed with her or not, she'd forced the league and the Fever fan base to confront the uncomfortable truth about how superstar systems really work. And while the noise grew louder, Sophie's name started trending for all the wrong reasons, setting the stage for an even bigger storm that was about to hit next.
But here we go. I'm so sick of Sophie, bruh. Please get the hell on. What'd she do? Yapping too damn much as usual. I mean, she said nothing we don't know. Exactly. I think this kind of thing is fairly obvious if you're paying attention.
The moment Sophie Cunningham's clip hit social media, chaos erupted. Within minutes, her comment about Caitlin Clark controlling the Fever's offense became the most replayed snippet of the week. What Sophie saw as a compliment, comparing Caitlin's generational influence to that of LeBron. James was twisted into something else entirely. Twitter and TikTok turned the discussion into a war zone. One side praised Sophie for being fearless, finally saying what coaches and analysts have hinted at all season. The other side tore her apart, accusing her of clout chasing, locker room betrayal, and exploiting Caitlin's name for attention. It wasn't just criticism, it was venom. Under every post, you could see the divide forming in real time. Fever fans who once defended Sophie were now calling her a distraction. Others mocked her podcast, saying she was more interested in building a brand than a legacy. But beneath all the noise, there was something deeper happening, a generational split within the WNBA's growing fan base. The old-school fans, loyal to the traditional structure of team hierarchy and quiet professionalism, couldn't stomach a player speaking so bluntly about internal dynamics. The new wave, however, the Caitlin Clark generation, loved the transparency and energy Sophie brought. They saw her honesty as refreshing in a league often shrouded in PR-safe answers. Still, social media thrives on outrage, not nuance. Comment sections filled with wild accusations. Some said she talks too much. Others implied jealousy, claiming Sophie was trying to attach herself to Caitlin's spotlight. And then came the racial undertones. Trolls suggesting fans only defended Sophie because of how she looked, while others fired back, saying she was being unfairly vilified for being confident and outspoken. It was ugly, but it revealed the raw emotion bubbling under the WNBA's surface. Even more surprising, a few self-proclaimed Caitlin Clark fans joined in the pylon, insisting Sophie should stop speaking on CC's business. They argued that her comments put unnecessary pressure on Caitlin, creating headlines that would follow her into every press conference. But ironically, these same fans failed to realize Sophie was defending Caitlin, validating her talent, her leadership, and her right to command a system built for her strengths. Meanwhile, Sophie stayed silent as the storm raged online. No apologies, no clarifications, just silence, and that silence only fueled the fire. The media began framing her as a problem teammate, while podcasts debated whether the Fever should cut ties before next season, all this over a statement that, if said by a coach or analyst, would have been considered a compliment. The backlash was proof of one thing in the WNBA's new media era. Perception is everything. Players aren't just athletes anymore, they're brands, constantly judged by how their words trend online. Sophie's truth became content, and as fans turned against her, the question loomed. Was she being punished for honesty? Or for breaking the unspoken rule that players must stay silent about what really happens behind the scenes? As the social media storm intensified, the narrative around Sophie Cunningham began to shift. What was once seen as a simple basketball discussion suddenly became an accusation of betrayal. Critics claimed Sophie had crossed the line by talking about team dynamics on her podcast. To them, she'd broken an unspoken code, The one that says what happens inside the locker room stays there. But the irony was impossible to ignore. Sophie hadn't revealed any secret strategy or exposed private drama. She'd simply said that Caitlin Clark, a player with once-in-a-generation talent, deserved a system that played to her strengths. Still, the online mob didn't care about nuance. In their eyes, Sophie's honesty was now disrespect. Inside WNBA circles, opinions were just as split. Some veterans quietly agreed with Sophie, but kept their support behind closed doors. They knew how quickly public opinion could turn toxic. Younger players, however, were watching closely, some admiring her courage, others learning a hard lesson about what happens when a woman in sports speaks her mind. Sophie had unintentionally become the face of a new kind of controversy, not about basketball performance, but about the politics of openness in the digital era. What made it sting even more was that Sophie wasn't a fringe player. She'd earned her respect in the league through grit, hustle, and heart. Her willingness to defend Caitlin Clark physically on the court, even taking elbows and hard fouls for it, had made her one of the few Fever players fans actually trusted to protect their rookie star. Yet the same fan base that once celebrated her intensity now turned their backs, calling her a liability and drama magnet. The double standard was glaring. Male players could voice their opinions on team systems all the time. When a woman in the WNBA did it, it suddenly became unprofessional. Behind closed doors, insiders whispered that some in the Fever organization weren't thrilled either. Team leaders wanted to keep media attention focused on Caitlin's rise, not internal commentary. There were even rumors that Sophie's podcast appearances had raised eyebrows among staff who preferred controlled messaging, but punishing her for speaking candidly would risk alienating the very fans who admired her authenticity. It was a lose-lose situation, one that showed just how fragile public perception in the WNBA had become. The situation also exposed a deeper question about the culture of silence surrounding women's sports. Why was open dialogue treated as betrayal instead of insight? Why could a player not talk about her team's structure without being vilified? Sophie hadn't leaked private information or insulted teammates. She'd shared a perspective any analyst could have said on live TV. Yet, because it came from her, from someone inside, it was treated like a crime. And as the whispers grew louder, Sophie realized this wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about control. Who gets to speak, who gets silenced, and what happens when honesty threatens the image the league wants to protect. As the controversy grew, one person remained eerily quiet: Caitlin Clark, the young superstar, who usually handled media storms with grace, avoided addressing Sophie Cunningham's comments entirely. Not a single post, like, or interview, quote, hinted at her stance, and that silence spoke volumes. Fans and analysts immediately began reading between the lines, interpreting every expression, every press conference pause. To some, Caitlin's quiet meant agreement, a silent nod that Sophie had told the truth. To others, it looked like avoidance, a way to dodge the tension that now surrounded her team. Either way, her silence only gave the media more room to spin their own narratives. Sports shows, blogs, and podcasts jumped on the moment like sharks sensing blood. Some headlines praised Sophie for backing Caitlin's leadership, while others accused her of creating unnecessary drama. The truth was lost in translation as the story grew legs of its own. Suddenly, it wasn't about basketball philosophy anymore. It was about relationships, team chemistry, and power dynamics. Commentators began asking, has Caitlin lost the locker room? Or is Sophie speaking for her? The irony was that Caitlin had said nothing, but somehow she was the centerpiece of the entire debate. Inside Indiana's camp, sources hinted that players were frustrated by the media's obsession with every word linked to Caitlin. Some felt overshadowed, others exhausted. For a young roster still finding its rhythm, constant media noise was the last thing they needed. Yet it kept coming because controversy sells. And when you combine a breakout star with an outspoken veteran, you get a storyline that writes itself. The Fever's growing pains became national entertainment, dissected in clips, thumbnails, and endless hot takes. Meanwhile, Sophie's reputation continued to swing wildly depending on who you asked. To some fans, she was a fearless truth-teller defending her teammates' greatness. To others, she was a self-promoter, chasing attention. But one thing became clear. The more the media twisted her words, the harder it became for the actual truth to survive. What Sophie had said, that Caitlin Clark should influence how the team operates, wasn't controversial in context. It only became controversial because people needed it to be. Even in her silence, Caitlin became the unintended symbol of the WNBA's growing culture war between tradition and transformation, between humility and influence, between team-first values and superstar marketing. She didn't ask for it, but every story, every clip, and every social media debate kept placing her in the center. And as the attention kept building, it started to feel less like admiration and more like a burden by staying quiet. Caitlin avoided direct confrontation, but that silence allowed the storm to grow unchecked, making Sophie's words seem louder, harsher, and more divisive than they ever were. And with every headline twisting her intent, the question shifted from what Sophie said to how much longer the Fever locker room could withstand the pressure of a controversy they never asked for. Inside the Indiana Fever's locker room, tension was building long before Sophie Cunningham's podcast went viral. The team was already navigating a mix of youth, ego, and the spotlight that came with having Caitlin Clark the most talked about player in women's basketball at the center of it all. Every practice, every press conference, every loss was magnified. So when Sophie's comments hit the internet, the ripple effect reached deep inside that room. Players who once laughed together on flights were now walking on eggshells. No one wanted to be quoted, misinterpreted, or dragged into the storm. According to insiders, there were mixed reactions. Some teammates quietly agreed with Sophie's take, admitting that the offense often looked lost when it didn't run through Caitlin. Others felt frustrated, believing that Sophie's remarks made the team look divided. The word trust began to surface in hushed tones. Trust between teammates, trust in leadership, and trust in what was said behind closed doors. The Fever were supposed to be building chemistry, but instead, they found themselves fighting a narrative that questioned their unity. For Caitlin, the attention was suffocating. She never asked for the offense to revolve entirely around her. But she also knew that, as the franchise player, expectations would always orbit her name. Every time she scored big, headlines praised her brilliance. Every time she struggled, fingers pointed to the system. And now, with Sophie's comments in the mix, even her leadership was under the microscope. Did she support Sophie's honesty? Did she think the offense was flawed? Her silence gave everyone permission to speculate, and speculation spreads faster than facts. Meanwhile, Sophie's relationship with some teammates began to cool, not because of hatred, but because of exhaustion. Teammates were tired of defending questions that had nothing to do with basketball. When reporters showed up, the conversation wasn't about wins or improvement. It was about Sophie's podcast. The frustration became palpable. Even the coaching staff reportedly urged players to refocus, trying to pull the narrative back toward the game itself. But by then, the noise outside had already seeped in. Sophie, however, didn't back down. She continued practicing hard, showing up with the same fire she always had. To her, the backlash proved that honesty in sports still made people uncomfortable. She wasn't going to apologize for caring about how the team played, or for believing in Caitlin's potential. Still, the damage had been done. The Fever, once the underdog darlings of the WNBA, were now seen as a team divided. One superstar trying to find her place, and one veteran fighting for her voice to be heard. As the team prepared for the next stretch of games, everyone knew something had changed. The smiles felt forced. The conversations were shorter. The trust that once came naturally now had a shadow over it. And in a league where chemistry can make or break a season, that tension was beginning to show, not just in the headlines, but on the court. The more the drama unfolded, the more glaring the double standards became. Commentators began to ask the question fans were already whispering online: why is Sophie Cunningham being dragged for saying something NBA stars have said for decades? When male players talk openly about team systems or leadership roles, it's praised as basketball IQ or veteran insight. But when a woman in the WNBA speaks with that same confidence, it suddenly becomes unprofessional or disrespectful. Sophie's case highlighted that ugly truth better than any press conference ever could. She wasn't the first to face it, but her situation exposed just how deep that bias still ran. Some insiders said the league itself quietly prefers players to stay silent, to smile for cameras, promote the brand, and avoid anything that might seem controversial. But Sophie never fit that mold. She's brash, emotional, and unapologetically vocal. The kind of player who calls out unfair play, steps up for her teammates, and doesn't water down her opinions. And for that, she's often painted as difficult. Yet those same traits are celebrated in her male counterparts. When Draymond Green calls out his coaches or defends his star teammate, he's seen as passionate. When Sophie does it, she's stirring the pot. The criticism reached beyond basketball circles. Some sports journalists argued that fans, especially in women's sports, still struggle with outspoken personalities. They want authenticity, but only if it stays polite. Sophie broke that rule, and it rattled people. She refused to be another player who just said what fans wanted to hear. She spoke like someone who'd actually lived the game. Raw, emotional, imperfect. And that authenticity, though messy, is exactly what the WNBA needs if it wants to grow beyond its current bubble. At the same time, her silence in the aftermath became its own statement. Sophie didn't issue a clarification or a half-hearted apology. She let the media argue while she kept training. Posting, cryptic motivational captions like "Truth never fears," the spotlight. It was her quiet way of saying she wouldn't be controlled by the noise. That boldness earned her both admirers and enemies. But at least people were talking about her for something real. The controversy also reignited debate about the WNBA's relationship with its stars. The league constantly asks players to build their brand and be visible, yet punishes them socially when that visibility isn't perfectly packaged. Sophie became an unintentional mirror for that contradiction. She did everything modern athletes are encouraged to do: speak honestly, host a podcast, connect with fans. But the second she said something that challenged comfort zones, the backlash hit. In the end, Sophie's situation was bigger than a soundbite. It became a symbol of how women's voices in sports are still policed and filtered. She may have sparked outrage, but she also forced a conversation the WNBA has avoided for years about who controls the narrative and who gets punished for simply telling the truth. As the criticism reached its peak, most expected Sophie Cunningham to fold, issue an apology, go quiet for a few weeks, and let the storm fade. But Sophie isn't built that way. Instead of backtracking, she doubled down. She didn't rant or lash out, but her actions spoke volumes. She kept showing up early for practice, engaging with fans, and posting clips that reminded everyone she was still grinding. Her podcast returned just days after the controversy, and though she didn't address the backlash directly, her tone was sharper, her confidence louder. It was as if she'd decided that if people were going to label her the villain, she might as well own it. That decision changed everything. Fans began to see a different side of Sophie, not just the outspoken athlete, but the fighter who refused to be silenced. Support started trickling back in. A few influential sports pages began to defend her, calling the backlash performative outrage. Commentators who initially criticized her started admitting she might have had a point. After all, when you strip away the noise, what had Sophie really done? She'd given her opinion on team strategy, praised her teammate, and highlighted the obvious that Caitlin Clark is a once-in-a-generation player. Somewhere along the way, the outrage stopped making sense. The turning point came when an old clip resurfaced from earlier in the season. The moment Sophie stood between Caitlin and a rival player during a heated game, physically defending her when no one else did. That video went viral again, but this time in a different light. Fans who once called her a distraction began remembering why she mattered. She was the one who always had Caitlin's back on the court. She was the one taking hits so her star teammate didn't have to. Suddenly, Sophie's blunt honesty didn't look like betrayal. It looked like loyalty. Her defiance also inspired younger players around the league. Some even publicly thanked her for keeping it real, and for reminding everyone that athletes have the right to speak on the game they live every day. It was a subtle shift, but a significant one, the kind that changes perception from controversy to courage. Sophie wasn't perfect, but she was real, and in an era of filtered interviews and scripted quotes, that authenticity was starting to stand out. Even league executives reportedly took notice. Behind the scenes, there was talk about whether the WNBA needed to adapt to let players show more personality, to stop punishing outspoken voices, and to embrace the drama that drives fan engagement in men's sports. Sophie's controversy had accidentally become a case study in visibility and freedom of expression. By the end of that turbulent month, Sophie had turned her critics into conversation starters. What began as hate was now respect, and what started as an accusation of betrayal had evolved into something much bigger. A reminder that honesty, even when uncomfortable, can reshape an entire league's culture. By the time the dust began to settle, Sophie Cunningham's controversy had transformed from a social media scandal into something far more meaningful. What started as a single podcast comment had forced the WNBA and its fans to confront an uncomfortable reality. The league says it wants authenticity, but it isn't always ready for it. Sophie didn't just stir up a debate about Caitlin Clark or the Fever's offense. She cracked open a conversation about freedom of speech, media bias, and how women in sports are treated when they refuse to stay quiet. Analysts started admitting what many fans already knew. Sophie was right. The Fever's offense looked disjointed when it didn't run through Caitlin. When it did, they played faster, smoother, and with more rhythm. What Sophie said wasn't an attack. It was an observation backed by results. But because it came from a player and not a coach, it was treated as controversy. That double standard exposed how differently female athletes are judged for expressing leadership opinions.n. It wasn't just about Sophie. Her moment reflected a growing shift in the WNBA's culture. Younger players are beginning to see media presence and open dialogue as part of the job, not a threat to it. They want to build their brands, tell their stories, and connect directly with fans. But Sophie's backlash showed the risks of being too honest, the possibility of being labeled a problem for speaking your mind. For a league trying to balance professionalism with growth, that contradiction couldn't be ignored any longer. As the season went on, a few surprising voices came to Sophie's defense, including former players, coaches, and sports journalists who argued that honesty drives engagement. They pointed to how male-dominated leagues thrive on strong personalities and open debates. Why should the WNBA be any different? If anything, Sophie's words gave the league what it's been craving for years: relevance, drama, and passionate conversation. People were finally talking about women's basketball beyond scores and stats. Caitlin Clark, for her part, eventually acknowledged Sophie's support in a brief interview, thanking her for always having my back. That small sentence shifted public tone once again. Suddenly, the story wasn't about betrayal. It was about sisterhood, loyalty, and how messy honesty can still come from a place of love. By then, Sophie had already weathered the storm. Her name had become synonymous with defiance, but also with courage. She reminded everyone that progress doesn't come from silence. It comes from people willing to speak, even when it costs them comfort. The controversy had changed her reputation forever, and in doing so, it changed the WNBA's. The message was clear: if the league truly wants to grow, it has to embrace voices like Sophie's, not silence them. Because sometimes, the truth that burns the brightest is the one everyone's been too afraid to say. In the end, Sophie Cunningham's so-called controversy became more than just a viral headline. It became a turning point for the WNBA. What began as one player's honest BASKET, opinion evolved into a full-blown conversation about leadership, authenticity, and double standards in women's sports. Sophie didn't just defend Caitlin Clark. She defended the right of every athlete to speak truth without fear of being silenced. Her courage forced the league, the media, and the fans to reflect on what kind of voices they truly value, whether people loved her or hated her. Sophie reminded everyone that growth doesn't happen in silence. It happens through honesty, discomfort, and conviction. And as the WNBA continues to evolve, her voice will echo as a symbol of that change. Raw, fearless, and unfiltered. Sometimes the truth hurts, but sometimes it's exactly what a league needs to hear.